So welcome back, guys. To start, we'll be looking at height fields, and these are obviously the base for everything that we'll create going forward. So it's a good idea to start with these guys, right? So height fields. What is a height field? A height field is a 2D volume node that we use to create 3D geometry on the y-axis. And it's pretty efficient because what we're working with isn't geometry, but rather a volume that we will convert into geometry later. So it's very easy and quick to work with. Now this is the final result of what we will create, and I've tried my best to match any reference that we had been looking at before, and also to make this as efficient as possible for the shot that we're using it for. So let's take a look at the height field node and what it does. So I'll drop down a new one. I'll just hit tab, type in height, and drop down a height field. So what you'll see initially is this square grid. And although you can't see it, it does have a density. We can control the density here under grid spacing. We can control its size under size here, and its center in the world. But it's really hard to show you what the height field does unless we put down a node to manipulate it. So let's drop down a height field noise. Now, as mentioned earlier, there is not always a need to create complex geometry. Sometimes a height field and a height field noise is enough if it's just for background mountains or background terrain. So let's plug this in and we'll turn it on. And you can see exactly what it's doing. It's very similar to the mountain node. I'll jump back to the height field node just so we can talk about what the height field node does. Now we have this other node as a way of viewing the setting changes. So we can change the size, it's pretty self-explanatory. We can change its center. Now you can see as we move this around, the noise and everything about height fields are projections from top down. So if we move this around 3D space, we don't really change the projection. And the grid spacing is what dictates the detail. So if we put it down, it works in world space. If we put it down, it means we have more divisions. If we put it up, we have less. Now, it's best probably to work with a pretty high grid space until you get the shapes or the forms that you need. And then you can add more detail later. So let's put it up quite high. Let's set it to about 10, just for now. And if we move down to the height field noise section, I'll also zero this out. You can zero anything out by control and middle clicking. Let's take a look at some of the settings here on the height field noise. Now, again, if you're used to Houdini, quite a lot of these are self-explanatory, but you'll notice a couple of different options. So we have height at the top, and we have mask below. And we can change this mask. We'll come back to that in a second. We also have combine method, and this is when we want to blend a couple of different height field nodes together. We also have a separate node for that. Again, we'll look at that later. Amplitude and element size, these do what you expect. They increase the amplitude or they change the scale. We can adjust the noise type. There are a lot of different patterns here. And if you have used World Machine, you might be familiar with some of these, and you might already know the power of blending some of these together. Again, we'll cover that in a second. The fractal type I would ignore. The max octaves just change the iterations within the noise. Lucernity works kind of like scale. Roughness increases the roughness or the softness of the noise that we're using to generate this height field. Now, the post-processing section of the height field noise is one that can be overlooked, but you can create a lot of very cool shapes with it, kind of like hills and rolling hills. So for instance, if we press fold, you'll see that everything almost dips in towards itself. If we then play with the element size, you can see that you can create some pretty interesting shapes that are reminiscent of the type of hills that you might see just before we transition into mountains. So we'll come back to this too, but it's a very powerful option. Next we have complement, and again this will invert whatever you have going on here. And finally, one that you may miss again, but which is very important, is the distortion drop-down menu. And here we can add a lot of warp and natural distortion to the whole thing. So if I enable lattice warp, and we'll rack it up a little bit so you can see what it's doing. Let's put it to like 10 or something. And I'll put down the amplitude. You can get some pretty interesting effects. Now, this is applied to the fold, so if I disable the fold, and let's rack this back up and take the lattice warp back down a little bit. It's too much. What it does is it starts to break up what looks like the procedurally generated landscape that you sometimes get. It was a big problem in World Machine where to get this type of distortion you had to use plugins from Quad Spinner, but we get it right out of the box here in Houdini. So let's switch on the gradient warp and we'll dial in some values, and what you can see is it increases the difference between the peaks and the valleys of the distortion that we're using. And the last thing I want to do for this video is let's bring in a mask. Let's create a mask. There's two ways to do it. You can either throw down a height field mask, and it's a height field paint mask. We'll plug in the height field to the top, and you can see we get this icon over the cursor, which is a sphere. And we can make that bigger by holding in shift and using the middle mouse button, similar to the sculpting node that already exists. And we can just start painting on our mask. So this is any area that we want to be affected by the noise in this case. When we go back to the height field noise, we can plug in the height field paint, and there you can see that only the areas that we painted become affected. We can do this at the same time if we like. We can have this highlighted and we can paint in these areas. The other way to do this, if I delete this and remove this connection here, is if we connect this guy up here, we can then press the paint mask option. And this creates us a node. It's thrown it all the way down here. And again, we can paint that in wherever we want. So that's just a quick demonstration of the 3 most important tools to get you started. And next we'll obviously go into more advanced methods, and we'll see how we can manipulate these tools to create some pretty interesting and unique shapes. Thanks.